Welcome to Ally Kind. This is episode 4 of an N-part series. And when I say N, I mean that mathematical symbol that could represent any number because it hasn't been predetermined, probably 5. This is the 4th episode. So let's do a recap on where we've been. So, first episode in this series on decentralized spirituality was starting this comparison of decentralization in technology to positing a parallel trend happening in spirituality. Made some comparison points there. Biggest takeaway of that first episode was how can we center the locus of the sacred in the body of each human being. We can then think of each human as part of a decentralized network, connected network. Second episode is exploring in a sense, a little bit of nuance around that first episode, discussing the inner and the outer. So that finding the sacred in each person is that esoteric or inner orientation, acknowledging that we all have different identities and communities and practices and beliefs. That we all have our exoteric affiliations. So exoteric meaning the outer. So perhaps you're a Muslim and they're a Buddhist. Perhaps I'm a Christian and he's an atheist. So, and this one's a scientific materialist. So we all have our different, let's say, ways our beliefs kind of express themselves in the world. But I really wanted to emphasize with that second episode that no matter what kind of beliefs or communities we're part of, that however we want to call the sacred, whether or not that works for you, sacred, divine, the mystery, cosmos, the universe, life, that it's built into who we are. You can't have us without it. Okay, third episode. That went into it was really a conversation about, you could say, decentralizing philosophy. So part of the idea in decentralized technologies is that you don't need to centralize the intelligence. You don't need a big Amazon server in Seattle where all of the data is stored. We can decentralize that intelligence. We can distribute it on servers, computers, phones. These distributed devices are the intelligent edges of the network. So, to connect this to that third conversation, it's really important to, let's say, decentralize who has the right to know, understand, and be intelligent. I would say that our hierarchical education, academic, and social systems really, they kind of operate in forms of elitism, and with things like intelligence tests or the SATs, they're ranking and separating people based on how well they perform on these tests. But the radical thing I want to say is that I don't care what your so-called quote-unquote IQ is, because each of us has an intelligence that is of a higher order than what we normally think of as an intelligence. It's what we call the sacred, the divine, knowing, being, wholeness. I want to say that is the real intelligence. So whether you went to college or not, whether you get paid a lot or not, we're all equal in this access to true knowing. It's a really important component of a decentralized framework around spirituality. Each node, each human is totally equal to every other in terms of being an embodiment of the divine, of divine intelligence. So I'll leave it up to the education systems to figure out how to sort themselves out in relation to that, because it honestly is a shame. It's a real shame that we put so much emphasis on these IQ tests, because it makes people who aren't good at them feel like they're not as good, and that's BS, to be honest. So we got a lot of work to do in terms of that, and I won't even get into. There's a great paper by Oludemini Ogunnaike. He's a professor at William and Mary, and I won't get into this, but I just want to drop it because it shows the importance of this shift in thinking. He basically says, like, the rise of modern racism is rooted in the way we moved away from an orientation to the divine, and we moved into an orientation or a centering of the quote unquote rational mind, rationality. And they give you one more nugget from that. Basically, when the collective belief system, let's say in the West, was oriented on this divine order, every human was considered to be created by God. And so what we now know as like slavery and modern racism didn't actually exist in the way it has in the last few hundred years, because you didn't have, fortunately, that there was at least some kind of ethical limits to all of the ignorance of ethics in the church. But at least there was something about, like, well, you can't treat them like an animal because they're a human, and that's because of God. Once we got rid of the kind of like divine framework, and we started to move into quote unquote the Enlightenment and scientific quote unquote progress. I'm not saying that stuff's not all good, or there isn't a lot of amazing things in that, but we did flip this framework. Well, all of a sudden we could have our logic, rational minds be the arbiter of truth rather than this divine standard. And all of a sudden we could go like, ooh, people who look like this are lower than people who look like this, so we can treat them however we want. And in fact, like, enslave them and say they're not even human in the way we are. So this is all very tied in, and I'm sure someone's written about this stuff. It's all very tied into things like intelligence, the SATs, how we ascribe value to human beings. And I would say it's deeply dysfunctional. So without further ado, that's essentially what we're getting at in the third episode, was laying some foundations to really validate, to value you, me, everybody. We're equal in this. This is why we can have a decentralized spirituality, or let's say bring attention to the possibilities of that, because of that honoring of each of us. Fourth episode, here we go. Now, you might notice I've got a very multicolored outfit on. You can't see it, but it is in fact a jumpsuit. So just imagine this all the way down to my feet. And I don't know if you binge watch TV shows during the pandemic, but one of the first ones I did back in the spring of 2020 was Money Heist, this Spanish show, and in which these kind of I won't go into it, but basically let's say these clever heist group. They try and rob like the banks or whatever from a lot of money, and they're all wearing these red jumpsuits, and I was like, oh, those look great. So I bought a couple jumpsuits, and I think I decided that I'm only going to wear jumpsuits the rest of my life. That hasn't played out, but it could still be an admirable goal, so maybe I'll get there. So why am I wearing a multicolored jumpsuit? I really wanted to evoke with my attire the theme of today. Any guesses? This isn't live, so guess away. In fact, you can pause this and guess as many times as you want. I will give you the answer. The theme today is the imagination. And, you know, I don't have notes on how this is going to go, so I'm just going to roll into it. But I've been feeling a little bit intimidated by today's lesson. I don't want to call it lesson, but topic, conversation. Because it is such a big, meaningful, and I would say transformative concept. Especially when we get into what the imagination really is, which I'm going to say that most of us haven't been told about what the imagination really is. Let me pour some tea. I have a special tea today. It's from a famous area in Yunnan province. My Chinese is no good, but the shoddy pronunciation I have is like Lao Banzhong, and it's pu'er tea with quite a lot of energy to it. So if I seem to have a spring in my step, perhaps it's the tea, or perhaps it's the theme of the imagination today. I'm going to pull up an image to share with you. Let's get into screen share. All right, now here we have our friends, the Beatles, their famous Sgt. Pepper album. And this was a massive adventure in the imagination. If you listen to their music before this album, complete like explosion in imagination. So not only do I want to posit that we can have this decentralized spirituality, but I want to posit that there's a massive element that can infuse our spirituality, which hasn't been tapped. The imagination. And I'm going to be giving you a lot more on this today. So this is big, I believe. So this is our little metaphor here with the Beatles. Like, imagine that our spiritual lives or our relationship to our being can be imaginalized in the way the Beatles imaginalized everything they were doing with the music. They had their thing. It was like Revolver, Help, and then they took their musical thing, their musical being, and they mashed it up with a massive amount of imagination. And that's what I'm saying is a possibility for us with our spiritual beings. What if our being meets the imagination? What could that open up for us? Let's pour some tea. This tea is so powerful. I have to, as soon as I pour it, I have to unpour it so it doesn't get too strong. I told you I'm a nerd, and I'm a tea nerd as much as any other kind of nerd. I will show you. Well, I won't show you now because the Beatles are up there. Let me take them off the screen. I'll show you this beautiful teapot. Let's see. Oh, look, it's got a little bit of tea poking out. So that's a teapot from somewhere before the 1950s and earlier. And it's got really nice clay. And if you're a tea nerd, then you might start to get nerdy about things like clay because of how it affects your tea. Okay, let's get into another image here. I'm going to share the screen again. Do you remember my friend Ibn Arabi from episode 3? Let's bring up a quote from him. Okay, so this is a massive, massive quote. I mean, you could get a tattoo of this one. It's so profound and endlessly vivifying. So as I mentioned the other day, Ibn Arabi, I think I got the century wrong, but he was born in the 12th century and rather than the 11th, and is considered the greatest Sufi slash Islamic teacher of all time. So this dude's a legend. Let's just put it that way. He wrote, I believe he may have written 700 books, 400 of them are compiled, archived, with about at least 300 of those roughly verified as being absolutely of his provenance. So first of all, it's just incredible that I compared him to like Einstein and Shakespeare. It's incredible, not just that there's that amount of work that is validated of someone of his stature, but that the dude, the master, that we have so much written text from him. And like I said, it's only just in the last 50 years is being translated into English. So my personal feeling, and it's just my opinion, take it for what it's worth. But I have this inkling that just like, and maybe I'm making this up, I think there's some truth to it, that the 19th century was the century in which the Hindu influences completely shifted the West, that as those got imported, infused into the West, it just blew up all of this thinking, transcendentalism, go on and on. The 20th century, massive influence on Buddhism in the West. We see it with mindfulness. We think it's gone mainstream, but it's only just starting to explode in terms of the way the science is going to keep digging in and validating the mindfulness. So Buddhism, mindfulness, all of that jazz. I think this is an inkling. 21st century could be the century in which the Persian, the Sufi, the Islamic orientation to the imagination blows up in the West because we've not had access to these texts. So if you just think of it as very simply, these trends or these developments, these interests, why did they happen? It's because the stuff got translated in English. And that has only happened in the last, like I said, really the Ibn Arabis, the Henry Corbin translations, etc. Survadi, I might not be pronouncing that right, Avicenna. These are all new to us, and they made a big like impression in 60s, 70s, like poets like Dan de Prima, some of those cats back then, they were getting into this stuff. Probably been fallow for a little bit, but I think it's on this resurgence. And but I don't think we're anywhere close to where it could be. So keep your ears out, keep your eyes out, get on the tip. The imagination via this Persian Sufi Islamic lens. Powerful thing, very powerful thing. Let's get into this quote talking about powerful things. All of existence is imagination within imagination. All of existence is imagination within imagination. We might as well just close this talk down now and just like sit with these words, because I don't know what to say to a quote like that. It's I guess I'll just pause for a moment with it. If we're all here in a room, I'd be curious to ask you, what does this quote mean to you? What does it elicit? What does it provoke? How does it resonate? I mentioned Oludamini Ogunnaike earlier, that paper on the rise of modern racism. He also has an amazing paper. Did you ever see that film Inception by Christopher Nolan, the director? It's basically like worlds within worlds within worlds. So it's kind of like dreams within dreams within dreams. And in this paper, Ogunnaike, he basically is like comes out of a movie theater in, I think he was in Saudi Arabia maybe, or the UAE, and he's like, I felt like that movie was all about Ibn Arabi and a quote like this. So if you're a nerd, check out that paper. I'll link to it on the Ally Kind website. And I'll post about it at some point because it's amazing. Yeah, check out that paper. And if you have or haven't seen the film Inception, if you watch it in relationship to that paper and start really getting what Ibn Arabi is talking about, I feel like it's a massive amount of like liberation tied up in that, in this massive amount of liberation connected to the imagination. What does this quote mean to me? Let's touch in on something Ibn Arabi does talk about. He says we as human beings are have a really unique expression of the divine, because not only are we what the divine has imagined, has brought into being, we ourselves have this creative imagination of the divine as our own nature. So it's a very simple way you can connect this quote to that. That we are a form of existence, the human being, that is the divine imagination itself. And on top of that, everything we imagine, the world we construct with our beings, that we perceive, that's imagination too. This is where we really tie in to what I was talking about in that last episode. We as philosophers, when we wake up to the fact that all of our maps of reality, our philosophies of how life is, all of that is a projection of our own journey through our life, or you could say an imagination. Recognizing our imagination as imagination. That recognition can be really liberating, because if I think life sucks, if I'm imagining life sucks, and I can recognize, oh, that's just something I've imagined, then what else might I imagine? If I've imagined life is good, but only like this good, what if I can imagine that life is this good or expanseless? Expanseless. I think if that means really big, that's what I meant. If it doesn't, then just think without boundaries. Expansiveless. Anyway. This is why decentralized spirituality is so important, because I guarantee you, throughout history, institutions, I'm going to say the majority of the time, aren't giving us this information. Because if they did, why would we need them? I'm not saying we don't want communities, institutions, but let's imaginize them too. Let's balance things out. Let's decentralize spirituality. Let's imaginalize it. And let's reinfuse our institutions with that imagination, which I'm going to say is the same thing as love. You know, think about when the Beatles went off on this massive imagination journey, and where did they end up at the end of it all? All you need is love. Love, imagination, these are all like, I told that story of the blind man and the elephant in the first episode. These are all different ways of looking at something that is beyond what our human mind can really get. But we can feel, we can sense, we can be our way into that. We can rest or return or remember our way into that, because it's who we are. By the way, we're setting this all up for a how-to. When we get to the fifth one, if my internal map works out, we're going to get into a how-to here. So we're going to get there. We're going to get into the practical. We want to set it up first.